Good morning. It's good to see everyone here. At about 5 to 9, there weren't many people here. Everyone was right on time. And hopefully, God willing, this conference is right on time, at the right time. I want to address two things in my time today. One, why nationalism? Why national conservatism? Why now? And number two, from where national conservatism? Is this some strange foreign weed, or is this something intrinsic to our American experience? Starting with the why, it's unfortunately obvious, I think, to all of us. America is unraveling into an unhappy confederation of hostile tribes. Extremists on the right are murdering Jews in synagogues and African Americans in churches. The woke left is bullying us into a neo-segregation in which we're judged by the color of our skin and not the content of our character. We're too obsessed with growth to see that the rising economic tide has swallowed entire regions. We're too proud of our tradition of immigration to admit the failures of assimilation. At a time of such angry division, what can bind up our wounds? What can bring us together? A renewed patriotism would be a great start, but it's not enough. Patriotism asks us to love our country. What we need now is more than love of country. We need to love our fellow citizens. We must feel connected to each other, and a connection that is deep enough to overcome our superficial differences, a connection that's profound enough to motivate mutual sacrifice. We need to internalize the reality that our futures, the futures of every American citizen, are inexorably, even mystically, intertwined. What we need today is a renewed American nationalism. Yes, nationalism. Now that President Trump has declared himself a nationalist, this idea is the subject of heightened interest and preemptive attack. While the term is still quite vague, critics have rushed to fill it with the content of their worst nightmares. They insist that when we say nationalism, we mean white nationalism, nativism, blood and soil. Opportunists on the extreme right are only too happy to oblige as they rush to tap this potent political energy to fuel their own racist ends. Such efforts are bound to fail. In America, any effort to build a nationalism grounded in race will be crushed by the weight of our diversity and overwhelmed by the power of our ideas. While there have been great sins and shortcomings along the way, our leaders set us on a path that guaranteed that our American identity would eventually transcend blood and clan. And it has. The great challenge of our day is not creating the reality of diversity, but uniting a people so diverse. Fortunately, the very leaders who opened the doors to our diversity also authored the principles of our national unity. There is a deep American nationalist tradition. At this moment of great division, we'd be wise to revisit this tradition and better understand the premise and promise of American nationalism. While multiple American leaders have contributed to our tradition, three giants stand out from the rest: Alexander Hamilton, Abraham Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt. All three were economic nationalists who argued that Americans must be willing to spend public funds and sometimes pay higher prices in order to protect their fellow citizens from the powerful economic forces, both foreign and domestic, that could deny them an equal opportunity to rise in the world. But today I'd like to focus on the more fundamental question of how each of these giants defined what it is to be an American. This issue came into sharpest focus for them, as it so often does for us, in the context of immigration. Each of these leaders envisioned a nation into which immigrants could come and assimilate. But each believed that this assimilation required something more profound than general assent to a set of abstract ideas. They described instead an almost mystical process by which the foreign-born would be transformed into Americans over the course of years, spent dwelling on our soil, absorbing our culture, and internalizing our history. Let's start with Hamilton. Hamilton was the leading force behind ratifying the Constitution and building a strong central government under its blueprint. But he always insisted that Americans were united by something deeper than our documents and our institutions. After immigrating to America, Hamilton experienced colonial oppression alongside contemporaries from every colony. And he went to war together with them to win America's independence. He believed these experiences had forged an American nation well before the Constitution formalized the reality. Given this view of how American identity was formed, it's not surprising that Hamilton opposed efforts by Jefferson and others to permit the immediate naturalization of immigrants. Hamilton argued that before becoming citizens, these newcomers should first undergo some facsimile of the process that had transformed him and his contemporaries into Americans. That's why he stressed the need to give immigrants, quote, a reasonable term to, quote, get rid of foreign and acquire American attachments, to learn the principles and imbibe the spirit of our government. I want to skip to Roosevelt. When Theodore Roosevelt became president in 1901, the country had undergone 30 years of massive immigration. During this time, the population of the United States had almost doubled. Roosevelt was not anti-immigrant. On the contrary, he demanded that these new Americans be treated, quote, on an exact equality with everyone else. He called it an outrage to discriminate against any man, quote, because of his creed or birthplace of origin. But like Hamilton, Roosevelt placed a precondition on this ultimate acceptance. He demanded that the immigrant first, quote, become an American and nothing but an American, and, quote, assimilate himself to us. For Roosevelt, this process included learning English and abandoning the hyphens that he believed suggested ongoing loyalties to other people and other places. Now back to Lincoln. By Lincoln's day, immigrants were already streaming into America from new countries, especially Germany and Ireland. Lincoln was largely friendly towards immigrants, and over time he became increasingly outspoken in their defense. But he echoed Hamilton's belief that national unity could only be preserved if there was a naturalization process during which an immigrant should, quote, first dwell among us a reasonable time to learn about our ideals, history, and institutions, and then be, quote, put to some reasonable test of his fidelity to our country. That's the policy Lincoln supported. But as so often the case with Lincoln, his poetry was far more important than his policy. In two powerful statements separated by years but linked by a central homonym, Lincoln sent forth the most compelling vision of American nationalism we possess. Speaking to a group of immigrants in 1858, Lincoln acknowledged that many Americans were immigrants from new lands who shared no common blood with the authors of the Declaration of Independence. True. Yet Lincoln asserted that any immigrant who read the Declaration and identified with its moral sentiment had a right to claim it as, quote, though they were the blood of the blood and flesh of the men who wrote that declaration. Lincoln described this powerful connection as the, quote, electric cord in our Declaration that, quote, links the heart of patriotic and liberty-loving men together. It's quite a statement. But less than a few years later, Lincoln became president as the Civil War loomed. At this perilous juncture in our history, Lincoln seemed to recognize that the abstract ideas of his electric chord speech were insufficient to hold us together. He supplemented his prior formula with something more visceral and something more terrestrial. Lincoln closed his first inaugural address with his famous formulation of American nationalism. Everyone here has heard it, but it's worth paying attention to these words he used. Quote, "The mystic chords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." Here Lincoln echoes sentiments first expressed by Hamilton. He suggests that what unites us goes deeper than belief to include a shared history of struggle and sacrifice. Our American soil has been the burning ground upon which events transpired that forever bind us to one another. Only those who know our history can develop this requisite memory. Only those rooted on our soil can feel these chords reverberating down to the present day. Our identity has never been defined by blood or clan. We are instead bound together by electric chords and inspired by mystic chords. Anyone can become an American, but to do so they must undergo a transformation through which they acquire an American spirit and send down roots into the soil from which this spirit first emerged. I want to close on a personal note that I think best summarizes what these three nationalist leaders had to say about our American identity. A lot's been said about this conference, and Chris referenced some of it. We've been criticized from the left. We've been criticized from the right. In the process, these critics have described a monster that is unrecognizable to us. So I want to close by speaking about my nationalist role model, my nationalist hero. It's not Oswald Mosley. It's not Charles Lindbergh. My nationalist role model is actually my ideal immigrant. He's my grandfather. I mention the example of my grandfather not because he was unique, but precisely because he was so common. I imagine most people in this room have a parent, grandparent, great-grandparent who was an immigrant to this country and who taught them to love this country. In my case, it was a Jewish immigrant from Romania, my grandfather. As a Jew in those days, there were jobs he could never have and places he could never live. We in this room are not strangers to discrimination. My grandfather worked most of his adult life in a windowless sweatshop so that his children could partake in the opportunities offered to all Americans. We in this room are not so disconnected from adversity. But my grandfather loved America. His driving goal throughout his life was as noble as it was simple: to be an American. He'd tell me when I was growing up that when he was my age, his friends would be outside hanging out or playing stickball in the streets of New York. He'd sit in his small apartment studying English. He studied English every day because he saw in the English language the key to full American citizenship. And after he mastered the English language, he used his English to study our foundational texts and our history. It was my grandfather who taught me about Hamilton, Lincoln, Roosevelt, and so many others. It was my grandfather who taught me about the battles of Lexington and Concord, Gettysburg, Iwo Jima, and so many more. The fact that his English had a thick European accent made his insights no less profound and his lessons no less penetrating. My grandfather was fiercely loyal to America. Fiercely loyal to America. I and so many of you here today seek to emulate that loyalty. Critics watching these proceedings might question that. They might criticize it. That's fine. But please, please don't try to claim that this loyalty is some sort of betrayal. My grandfather taught me to love my fellow Americans regardless of their color or their class. I and so many of us here today seek to replicate this love. Critics might question that or mock it. That's okay. But please don't try to characterize this love as some kind of hate. We have enough division in this country, enough attacks. We are at each other's throats. Can't we take a step back? Can't we turn down the heat? Can't we see in our adversary a fellow citizen and brother? As Americans grow increasingly alienated from one another, a renewed American nationalism offers us a shining path back home. Thank you.